Hello and welcome to my video on the analysis of Shakespeare's use of language in his sonnets, and for this video I've chosen the Sonnet 17 as an example of such sonnets. And in order to talk about it, I'll first of all present the poem in general and also what a sonnet is exactly, as well as a summary of it. Then we'll move on to the stylistic devices, their interpretation, and lastly how I deal with sonnets in exams. So yeah, thanks for watching. So first of all, the Sonnet 17, also referred to as "Who will believe my verse in time to come," which is the first line of the sonnet, was written in 1609, which is still in the Elizabethan era, also referred to as Shakespeare's main creative period. It's also the last of the procreation sonnets. So the first 17 sonnets are referred to as the procreation sonnets, where Shakespeare addresses an unknown young, beautiful man who was his muse, and wants him to pass his beauty on, that is inspired his lyrical genius by having offspring, having children. And the first 17 sonnets of his 154 sonnets handle that exact topic and the beauty of the so-called fair youth. So yeah. Moving on to what a sonnet actually is. It's a poetic form that originated in the Holy Roman Empire by Giacomo da Lentini in Sicily in the 13th century, so a while back, although I believe there are no more really sources left from the Sicilian 13th century on sonnets, but we know that it originated from that point on, and it's also referred to it's also translated to little poem or sound from the Latin sonata, I believe. It was also adapted by lyrical masters such as John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, perhaps one of the most known English epic poems. And it was propagated and spread in different countries and over different continents, and it evolved over time. So the modern poetry often deviates from sonnets, and it started as such perhaps in the 18th is way too early. I believe in the 19th or 20th century, people started deviating from the classical forms of poetry, which you could recognize in modern poetry. So there are also many different forms of sonnets, also in their structure, but also in the way that they are handled as a poetic form in different countries. So for example, the German Baroque is very famous for using the sonnet structure, or the German sonnet structure, as well as Russian lyricists Pushkin, Hindu, and many other different cultures use sonnets in their own different unique way. So for the structure, a sonnet is described by its very strict structure and strict rhyme scheme. So in general, especially in English and Shakespearean sonnets, we have 14 lines with 3 quatrains, so 4 lines that rhyme within each other, and 1 couplet, so 2 lines that rhyme with each other. And you can see what I've written there, so A, B, A, B, and A rhyme, B and B rhyme, in that exact order. And they also have an iambic pentameter, and an iambic pentameter is basically the unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed order of a line in 5-syllable groups, because you have penta, 5-syllable groups. And this structure, as I already said, also deviates in different languages. So for example, in German you'd have 2 quatrains and 2 tritains. But we won't talk about that for now. We'll focus, of course, on Shakespeare. And this here is the Sonnet 17. You can also find it all over the internet, but if you want, you can read it, stop it, and read it right now. Because I'll be moving on with the overall structure I talked about, which resembles the sonnet structure, of course. So first, in the first line, I have made the text bold where it would be stressed. So here we also see the iambic pentameter. We have 5 syllables that are stressed, and it's always the second one. And the way that you can quite easily determine which one is stressed and which one isn't, especially in ones that have a very clear structure, is that you look at a two-syllable or multiple-syllable word and determine which one of those syllables would be stressed. For example, who will believe, the stress is on the leave. You wouldn't say be leave. So that is kind of the way I do it. And I also marked in colors so that you can adequately see which ones rhyme and which ones don't. And if you look at the slide prior, you see that they correspond exactly with the original sonnets. Oops, that was way too far. With the original sonnet structure. So you have the ABAB one, which is also found in this here, Sonnet 17. And if you've read it, you can basically summarize it as a plea to the fair youth that I already talked about when I talked about Shakespeare's sonnets, the young unknown man that inspired many of his writing, especially his sonnets. And I've divided the lines for their contents in the quatrains and the couplet, which is the most easiest way I do it also in exams. It's also my first steps for the interpretation of sonnets. And yeah, so we start with lines 1 to 4, which talks about the immortalization of the youth through poetry, because they won't procreate. And nobody will believe him. And that is also basically, as an introduction, the main talking point of the sonnet. The idea that there is this mortality and beauty and this degradation through time. And the fact that nobody will believe his writings because he's written, the words that he uses are something that are greater than what is possible. And in line 5 to 8, he also further elaborates on the fact that words cannot portray their beauty realistically, which is too good to be true. Then we have in line 9 to 12, his writing is purposeless and worthless, and the beauty is lost through his writing. So he also talks about his own writing while writing a sonnet, and writing about the effect that it would have or would not have in this case. And lastly, the couplet that we have, 13 to 14, it's this plea for fair youth to pass his beauty on through having children, procreating, and furthering his beauty along the generations. And it's also, the couplet is most often the volta of the sonnet, meaning the turning point, where there is a poignant statement most often, or even that the entire content of the sonnet changes in itself. And in the following, I'll give you 10 examples of rhetorical devices, of stylistic devices. And of course, there are many more to find even in this one sonnet alone, but I chose ones that are relatively easy to find and relatively easy to define, so you have seen different kinds of stylistic devices. And what I'll start off naturally is the first line, the first two lines, which is the rhetorical question: who will believe my verse in time to come, if it were filled with your most high deserts? And here, with the rhetorical question, it's an address to the reader, who of course cannot answer because it's rhetorical and because you're not there. And it's also most often, also in speeches, in political speeches, a strong introduction, because you grab the reader's attention by asking a question. And it also, within these two lines, introduces the evanescence, the perishability and the transience of beauty, and the passage of time and the degradation, the mortality of youth. And we also have the addressee, the you talked about, your most high deserts, in the second line, which also introduces this fair youth whom this is all addressed to. And by talking about his own verses, who will believe my verse, it's also a form of, I don't want to say fourth wall breaking, but it kind of is, because he refers to his own writing while writing, which I also find quite interesting and also deviates from general lyricism. Next up we have a personification in line 3. though yet heaven knows it is but a tomb. And personification generally give inanimate objects animation through verbs. So the heaven itself cannot know, but what the heaven stands for can know. And this is also a signification of mortality, which is also seen in heaven as an illusion. And I'll stay in this line also for the next one, because it's quite an important one. But bear with me. Heaven is also an illusion that could be interpreted to as godliness. And we know the importance of godliness and religion in the Elizabethan era, so it's natural that it would occur in his writing. And it also gives the fair youth a place in heaven and puts it on a pedestal. An allusion is generally when you allude to something, you refer to something either known by common knowledge that has no direct connection to it, so as a form of metaphor, or you can also allude to other works of literature or other media. Next up, again in the same line, you have the oxymoron, which is a contradiction and antithesis, but I don't believe it's an antithesis, not really, it's rather a descent between two words and two images, because you have heaven and you have tomb, which are opposite of each other as ending places of the soul to either transcend to heaven or remain in a tomb, but both signify mortality. Where on one hand you have heaven that symbolizes the eternity of beauty, but on the other hand you have the image of the tomb, which talks about the mortality of beauty and mortality of people in general. The next one, we have a repetition, which is quite self-explanatory. We have, and in fresh numbers, number all your graces. And repetitions are generally used for emphasis and to draw your attention onto that specific line. And similes are also quite easy to determine when you have words like or as. Be scorned like old men of less truth than tongue. He believes that with time to pass, his papers and his writings will be just as believable like old men that gossip and talk unreasonable things, and he fears, or rather he hypothesizes, that his writing about the fair youth will end up like that. So he has this comparison, this metaphoric comparison. And metaphors, I didn't include metaphors in my stylistic devices because in every line you can see a metaphor. And metaphors are generally a stylistic device so often used in literature, in lyrics, that you need to have a specific thesis you want to prove, which you would then use the metaphor for. So I saw no sense in interpreting every single metaphor, if you understand what I'm saying. Next up, we also have an alliteration, be scorned like old men of less truth than tongue. And an alliteration is when you have following words with the same first letter. So in this case it would be T. Although this would not be a full alliteration because the phonetic sounds of the letters are not the same. So you have the hard T and the soft the, and then and truth. But nevertheless, alliterations are used for emphasis and for a better sound, because sonnets, after all derive from the word of sound, so it should sound good. And in this case, it's the same line I already talked about, of less truth than tongue. So his writing bear no more truth than talk would have. We also have a parallelism, which hides your life and shows not half your parts, and the hide and the show are opposite of each other. And because of that, this line is poignant in a way, because it shows also a form of contradiction within itself in this one line. We also have a direct speech. This poet lies, such heavenly touches never touched earthly faces. And we also have the repetition of touch, but yes. And the direct speech is also a form of directing the attention of the reader onto those lines, and he in a way gives voices, hypothetical voices, theoretical voices to the way he believes his writings to be perceived, in the way that they would not believe such beauty to exist through his writing. And thus he also enlightens or emphasizes his own stance on it. And lastly, we have the anaphora, which is when two lines, mostly two following lines, that start with the same word or pair of words. In this case, we have and your two rights be termed a poet's rage, and stretched meter of an antique song. And it mostly shows, first of all, the similarity and the enumeration of those two lines, but it also puts special emphasis on the following line after the anaphora, namely the but. And couplets at the end of a sonnet are generally there for the turning point. The volta I already talked about, but this is further emphasized and further accentuated through the repetitive and at the start of the lines before that. And in the conclusion, we have kind of his solution to his problem. The fact that Shakespeare cannot immortalize his beauty, only the fair youth can through procreating. And that is basically the conclusion he gives with the closing statement. And after we've talked about the stylistic device in the language, that the eloquent and beautiful language that Shakespeare uses in his sonnets, as an example in Sonnet XVII, I'd like to just quickly talk about how I work with such things in exams. So of course, you'd read the poem, that's self-explanatory, but while reading, I like to put it in, kind of divide the poem into different parts, as you saw in the start. So we have the quartans and we have the couplet at the end. I would put it in this kind of division, and you also gain a first comprehension of the text, so you should know the theme and the context after you know who the author is, what time period it was written in. And if you deal with Shakespeare, of course it's all the same, but if we're talking about lyricism in general, the context is something you should pay attention to even from the start, so you can then later on put it also into your interpretation. And the next thing I do is mark the structure as I did at the start. So we have the meter, the iambic pentameter in this case, we have the rhyme, and we have, you know, the determination whether it's a sonnet or not. Next up, I would do the devices, and I'd also use a lot of different text markers and highlighters in order to do that, but first I would focus on the structural devices. What I mean by that is, for example, anaphoras or alliterations and direct speech are quite easily to see because they're different from the other text, and also enumerations and so on. They're generally there for emphasis, and they're easily spotted at the start, which is why I would mark them first. And then after I have all of those written down, and also, you know, write next to it what it would be. For example, if it's an anaphora, I would write anaphora or enumeration or whatever. But you then have these contextual devices such as metaphors, hyperboles, parallelism, oxymoron, all of these where you need to actually pay close attention to the text, which is why I would do this last, before the interpretation, where I take everything I've already worked out in the prior steps and put them all in one in a structured kind of way. So you may have to interpret it to a certain, I don't know, to a certain topic of love or peril or whatever. So you would choose the stylistic devices you need and are necessary for you to talk about that certain topic. Or if you need to interpret it in general, you also need to refer to the context and then take, for example, the historical context, and then you would take devices that are typical or non-stereotypical for that certain historical period, depending on what you need to interpret it on. Because I just gave you a very general view on the sonnet, and I hope that's sufficient to some extent. But yeah, if you've enjoyed this analysis, Thanks for watching. These are my sources. Have a nice one.